Hello there! In today's video, I'll cover my approach to level design for my 3D platformer game in Unreal Engine 5. Let's get right into it. The first step to level design is the concept. You need to think about the general look and feel of the level and how it ties into the game's story. As a solo dev, it's pretty much up to personal preference if you want to write the story first and then build the levels around it, or come up with cool locations and then write the story that justifies going there. It's also important to consider if it's an outdoor level or an indoor one. The next step is asset creation. This is the step I hate the most, since it's my weakest point. You need to create objects that you will use to decorate the level so that it doesn't feel empty. You must also create textures for the environment. This step never really ends, because even when you go to the further steps, you will most likely need to come back to edit some mesh or create additional textures or music tracks. So as you keep working on the assets, you can easily proceed to step 3. Grayboxing. Basically, it's about creating a general outline of the level, so you're putting down the floors, walls, and interactable objects tied to level progression. I also use this step to start designing puzzles and challenges by placing them in the world. This is also a good stage to start thinking about how the player will be guided through the level. Is there only one way forward that cannot be missed? Or maybe the scale or color of some object will attract the player to check it out. If the path forward isn't obvious and might be missed, then you might need to do something in the next step, which is adding details. In this step, you start placing the decorations you prepared around the level, applying all the textures, and I also use this step to start placing down NPCs, checkpoints, save points, and interactable objects. I also fix any rough edges left from grayboxing, and add lighting and objects meant to guide the player. This step also incorporates extensive testing, since you want to be sure that after replacing a grey platform with a nice and pretty mesh, the player is still able to jump on top of it and keep going through the level. And now that I covered each of the steps, let me give you an example of how I used them when designing levels for my game. So, concept. To be honest, this is where I made my greatest mistake. First I wrote the story, then built a few indoor levels around it. And by choosing indoor levels, I completely fucked myself. Unreal Engine provides an out-of-the-box sky system. It's even already configured if you create a third-person project. But for indoor levels, you also need to create the roof and the walls, textures for them, make sure it doesn't feel claustrophobic and that the camera's movement is not obstructed. Then you still need to create a bunch of assets and decorations that you would also need for an outdoor level. So essentially, building indoor levels is more work, especially in the asset creation stage. Oh well, lesson learned. For this level, my concept was a run-down corporate office with a bunch of trash lying around. I'm going to skip the asset creation step in this video, since that is a topic for a video that would take a few hours, and since I suck at 3D modeling, I'll leave that to the professionals. And now, grayboxing. I start off by placing some floors, walls, general lighting and boundless post-processing effects, and then testing if the level launches as it should. Despite the name, I prefer using assets with some textures on them. So my next step is placing textures on the floors, walls and roofs. That way I can immediately test if the textures look alright, or if they need some additional work, since textures like to change the way they look between Blender and Unreal Engine. For this game, I structured all my levels in more or less the same way. There's a big open area where the player has to go through some platforming challenge, puzzle or a fight. Then there's a corridor that leads to the next big area. I might add a few enemies or platforming objects in the corridors, but it's mostly to add variety rather than to actually challenge the player. I also build my levels so that the player can usually see the next corridor entrance from his current corridor's exit. That allows the player to form a plan how to navigate through the challenge and keeps the game progression path nice and clear. Alright, time to add some details. Once the grayboxed version is complete, I start placing down actors and meshes to decorate the environment. It's up to your preference if you want to graybox the entire level first and then add details to it, or do both on each area before progressing to the next one. Personally, I prefer being done with the grayboxing before decorating. Anyway, I also use this step to make sure that the player has a clear objective by putting shiny objects near to where they need to go, and I also spice things up a bit by removing platforms and instead forcing the player to platform off of decorations. This step might also require fine-tuning level lighting, exposition, and generally fiddling with various settings until you're either satisfied with the way it looks or simply burned out. When I'm done working on an area, I always playtest it multiple times to see if it looks alright from the player's perspective and also to ensure that the player can skip a challenge by parkouring off a decoration or something like that. If unlike me you have friends or you know someone who's willing to playtest for you, now is the time to ask them for help. As the dev you always know how to solve every puzzle, but it may be unclear to a normal player, so it's important to get this kind of feedback early on, so that you can fix it without causing any other issues. Both grayboxing and detail adding involve mostly placing down objects and transforming them in some way. So let me give you a few short tips on how to do that stuff quickly and efficiently in Unreal Engine. You can copy an object by holding down Alt and then using the left mouse button and dragging one of the axes on the object gizmo. You can also move your camera along with an object by holding down Shift and dragging the gizmo once again. And if you use Alt key and middle mouse button on the gizmo, then you can move around the pivot point, which is pretty useful when doing precise transformations on objects. Another useful feature is snapping a mesh or an actor to the surface directly below it when you press the End key. It's a nifty little time saver, since you won't have to manually place each mesh on top of another one. You can just put it somewhere above it and then use the End key. Sometimes you'll likely need to copy and paste an object that's out of view. Sadly, Unreal Engine pastes the new object next to the original one, but you can also go into the editor options and add a key binding to the paste here function. Then you can use that key to paste the actor where your mouse cursor is, rather than at the original object's location. Combining these few tips along with getting used to the navigation will let you design and build your own levels quickly and efficiently. And the last thing I'll talk about in this video probably comes intuitively to most devs, but I'll mention it anyway. When you're designing levels, you want to keep them fun, and in case of linear levels like the ones I'm working on right now, that probably means giving them some kind of a difficulty curve. I usually make it so that new elements are introduced slowly, one at a time, in a way that teaches the player how the object works. For example, in the current level, the first thing the player sees is the scaffolding with wooden platforms. That way the player learns to think of these things as simple small platforms, so the next time they see it, they'll know that they probably need to jump on top of it. In the next area, I introduce these orange beams. You'll notice that there is no danger around, and the player can jump on top of the beam and fall down as many times as they want. This allows the player to get accustomed to the beams and learn that they are platforming objects that are a bit more difficult to use. At the same time, I introduced the moving platform. In the last level, the platforms moved only to the side, so this time with the very first platform I showed the player that it can also move up and down or diagonally. In the next area, I introduce a death zone, where if you fall into it, you get teleported to the checkpoint and lose some health. I also introduce these small platforms that disappear shortly after you jump on top of them. Later on in the level, multiple of these objects will be combined to build difficult and complex challenges. Anyway, I probably won't be uploading videos for a while, since I want to focus all of my attention on getting through the project burnout that's been getting to me recently and completing the game. All the assets are already prepared, so I just need to finish building the levels, add a few bosses and test the finished product, so hopefully it'll be done soon. But that's all for today. See ya!